Please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrew Skotnicki.
Good evening, my friends. It's an honor to be here. Holy war, terrorism, and martyrdom. A daunting topic, and yet so timely and necessary, and such a joy to be able to talk about it with you, my friends, and my esteemed colleagues. And I thank you so much, my friend, for inviting me. In Christian tradition, there are three justifications, or better yet, three interpretations of physical violence. The first would come, and most important, would be found in what we call the paradigmatic texts. And those would be the Gospels, the stories of Jesus in the Gospels. That's what we would term as the grammar of Christian faith. That's the language you have to speak if you're a Christian. The second interpretation of physical violence in Christian tradition is a reflection upon those texts done in a pragmatic theological way of a people in the middle of history trying to understand what those texts mean in the light of the day-to-day struggles that human beings individually and socially have for security, for peace, and for self-defense. And that emerged in the late 4th century. It was called the just war tradition, still very, very active in Christian theology and in Christian discourse. The third interpretation of physical violence in Christianity is a theological distortion that honors neither the paradigmatic text nor the intellectual tradition, but rather couches the enemy and the other in apocalyptic terms, and always in the form of demonizing the other. And that would be the tradition, if you will, or the anti-tradition, in this case, of holy war. So let me briefly talk about the three. First of all, I always like to say, Rabbi, Jesus is and was a Jew. He was a Jewish boy, he was a Jewish man, and he died as a Jew and never intended to be anything other than a Jew, which I might say is quite a well-kept secret among Christians. Jesus came to form the Catholic Church, or gone Catholic. You know what I mean? Jesus didn't come to form the Catholic Church. Jesus came to be a messenger of peace. He came to be what we as Christians believe is not the founder of a new religion, but the teacher of unconditional love and unconditional forgiveness toward everybody. Jesus was, you could call him, and I play with this idea in this new book, Jeremy, of whether he was an antinomian. Nomos in Greek means law, and there's some question as to whether Jesus was an antinomian. He wasn't. Jesus loved the law because he was Jewish. But like other Jews, Jesus had what I call a contemplative interpretation of the law. And this, by the way, I would say the Sufis have the same position in Islam with regard to Islamic law. The foundation for Jesus of the law, which is beautiful to me, is that the Torah represents for Jesus the call to be mindful of God, just as the Quran is a reminder for Muslims to be mindful of God all the time, in the great and important events of life and in the most mundane. But what Jesus did with regard to the Torah was, rather than obey it literally, he took seriously the fact that he, like a good Jew or a good Muslim, was called to reflect upon God or Allah constantly. But the way in which law was understood was not as a rigorous tool to obey, but an invitation to love always and everywhere. And so Jesus, as many of you know, even those of you who are not Christian, only gave one law. You can comb the 4 Gospels all you want, but he only gives one law: unconditional love. And how do you know you love the other? Jesus says this very clearly twice in the Sermon on the Mount. Anybody can love the people who love them. In fact, you may not love them at all. It may be some form of enlightened selfishness. And so Jesus makes it clear that the only way you know you love is when you love the person who hates you, when you love the person who persecutes you, and when you love the person who, God forbid, tortures you and kills you. There is absolutely none justification for any form of violence in the teaching of Jesus Christ, simply from the texts, the paradigmatic texts of the gospel. Thus, there is absolutely no justification to hurt anyone. In fact, as you all know, it is the task of the Christian who literally believes what Jesus is, to suffer and to take blows, the famous turn the other cheek, but also to imitate Christ on the cross. And he says in his final act, Father, forgive them. Forgive them. Now, is there a concept of martyrdom? Of course there is. But martyrdom which shows up fairly regularly in the discourses of Jesus in three very important, most important texts. The first of which would be when he says, there is no greater love than to lay down your life for your friend. So the first concept of martyrdom is really what all Christians, and perhaps, as I say, since Jesus didn't come to form a religion, I can be a little expansive here and say maybe he's saying for all of us. Because I think implicitly you might even guess that. The greatest love of all is to die for another. So we have, and of course, his famous soliloquy on the cross, to forgive. And then we have the third one, which has sometimes been misinterpreted about martyrdom and the teachings of Jesus, and that is the Good Shepherd. He says in the Good Shepherd is guiding the sheep, and when the wolf comes, it is the task of the shepherd to stand before the wolf. He never says kill the wolf. He never says beat the wolf. He just simply says it is the task of the Good Shepherd when the wolf stands is to put the sheep behind him or her, as a good mother would do, as any loving human being would do, and to bear the brunt of the force of the adversary out of love for others. So that's holy war, terrorism, martyrdom in the teachings of Jesus. The just war tradition then becomes the intellectual attempt of Christians to make sense of those unbelievable teachings. And I think anyone, as we all know, would say, rather difficult for the ordinary man and woman to live, how to make sense of them in a violent world. And so I don't want to go in, maybe in the question and answer period, I could give you the actual details of what the just war is. But suffice to say, for the first 300 and plus years of Christianity, like our Jewish sisters and brothers, Christianity, as you may know, was an outlawed religion, and there were ferocious persecutorial attacks on the part of the Romans against them. All of that suddenly changed in 313 when Constantine decided to convert. And so the persecutor of yesterday became the persecuted of today. Prior to Constantine, you could be either burnt alive, fed to the lions, or, well, I forget what the other one was. Oh, crucified. Those were the three. The big one. How can I forget that one? That was the Roman punishments for people who were threats to the state, and they were the three punishments given to Christians. So Nero famously lit the Christians up in 64 AD and doused them with flames and used them to light the city streets. But the funny thing is that after 313, they who were persecuted, then they became the persecutors in many ways, because you had to be Christian. But the point I want to make is that the reflection of the just war essentially argued that there were, here's how the just war goes. It says simply, it's bad to kill, we should all love each other. But since we're not going to get along, and we are going to fight, let's at least have some moral guidelines. And without going into all of them, I'll just say quickly, it essentially has to do with a legitimate cause in the national interest, declared by competent authority, always a last resort. Must take into means whether or not it can be a successful war, must always ask the question whether or not the damage to be done outweighs the good to be gained, in which case it would not be a legitimate war. And then finally, what they call the jus in bello, the fighting of the war, always, first is the absolute protection of non-combatants, and secondly, the obligation to rebuild the nation that has been destroyed by the war. So in the just war tradition, and I add this parenthetically, Catholic scholars, me among them, but there's many who join me, say it's a nice tradition. The question is there ever been that far? It's nice to have around, but we wonder whether or not it has ever actually been a just war. But actually, in the just war tradition, there would be neither holy war nor terrorism nor murder. Because all of this is an intellectual exercise to give some moral guidelines to states as they ponder the question of violence. The final is what I call the holy war, which is the theological distortion. We all know the Crusades, the classic example of holy war. The holy war is always couched, and you mentioned it, Rabbi, couched in apocalyptic imagery. The holy war is never a war for political gain, never a war for strategic political interest, although I hasten to add, and I suspect you might agree with me, whatever the logic, the rhetoric of the holy war, there are always pragmatic economic and political gains. And I just will say it, somehow strikes my mind as an example. Martyrdom, same thing. There's no concept of martyrdom in just war, and the only martyrdom in Jesus' teaching is the martyrdom of love for the other to the point of death. But now everybody who fights in the holy war is now, well, we don't call them martyrs, we call them heroes. Everybody's now a hero. But we forget about the fact that they have one task, and that's kill other human beings. That's not a hero. Just to say quickly that you want to be able to say that the contemporary holy war does have acts of terrorism, despite the very severe and clear attempts on the part of those who justify it to avoid, quote, as we know, collateral damage. But we know from the acts of private security companies, we know what's happened in the prisons like Abu Ghraib, and we know from recent not only convictions but testimonies of American soldiers that wholesale killing of civilians does indeed take place. But I leave you with this, my friends, and this is my personal Andrew Skotnicki addenda. I don't blame terrorism on holy warriors. I blame terrorism on war itself. I think every war is an act